Our next speaker is Dr. David Fleming. He's the Director of National Museums Liverpool in the United Kingdom and President of the United Kingdom Museums Association. He oversaw the foundation of the International Slavery Museum and the Museum of Liverpool, both of which have added immeasurably to National Museums Liverpool's global reputation. Dr. Fleming will retire from his post at the end of this month and start a new chapter in his distinguished career as a visiting professor in museum studies at Liverpool Hope University. Please help me welcome back to New Orleans, Dr. David Fleming.
Thank you, Daniel. Excuse me. Okay. Thanks to everybody for inviting me all the way here. It's my third time in New Orleans, although I've spent such a small amount of time here, I confess I know nothing, including how to pronounce the city. In fact, I'm desperately frightened of now trying to pronounce anything, having listened to all the speakers. So I think New Orleans, is that near enough? Okay. Right, well, so thanks to Daniel for that introduction. Thanks to John and Priscilla for working hard to help me adjust to being on a different continent, and thanks to Elizabeth, or as she's known from henceforth, Dorothy. Where is she? She's not here. I should confess that when I set off from Liverpool a few days ago, my wife said, "Are you not taking any luggage in the hold of the plane?" And I said, "No, the Americans are very casual. It's not like going to China, where you have to turn up with a suit and a tie and everything, otherwise you'd cause offence." I said, "They won't mind if I go looking like a Canadian." So I came just with hand luggage and looking like this. People now think that Dorothy and I must be related because she has on a similar shirt. Anyway, the eagle-eyed among you will have noticed that there are two different titles for this talk. There's the original one, which is the one which I think is in your programme, A Shared History. And then there's the other one that when somebody said to me a while ago, "What's your talk in New Orleans called?" And I said, "Oh, I think it's called Transatlantic Slavery, the Liverpool Connection." That's the simple explanation. It's all about the connections between this side of the pond and the other side of the pond. And during my time here, and having listened to some of the other speakers, I've realised just how similar different cities are. I was just talking to a guy that's introduced himself. Sorry, I've forgotten your name already. So it lasted about 5 minutes. Who's from my part of the world, the Liverpool end, and I think what's true as I travel around the world is that port cities are very similar. That they have similar strength of characteristics. They're very diverse. They look outward. Liverpool is often described as the least English of all English cities, for example, and I suspect that this city is probably the least American of all American cities. And that's not meant to be an insult. There are a couple of other places that might lay claim to that too, to be fair, but nonetheless. Anyway, so we're linked in so many ways. I say we. I'm not actually from Liverpool. I'm from the city of Leeds. Leeds is a bit like Cleveland. It's a place that people might have heard of, but they don't know where it is. Whereas Liverpool is a place that people, at least in Britain and Europe and the Far East, tend to know where it is. It's linked with Shanghai. It's probably linked with New Orleans. I don't know. If it isn't, it probably ought to be. So there's a thought to come out of this conference. I'm very conscious that this symposium is about 300 years of New Orleans history. So in terms of the fact that I know nothing about New Orleans and I know a lot about Liverpool, I'm afraid you'll guess where the emphasis will be. But we're linked in very many ways. Does anybody here know where the last act of the American Civil War was? The very last act, the final surrender. It was in Liverpool. How bizarre is that? It was the surrender of the CSS raiding ship Shenandoah in the Mersey, and apparently the guys who sailed the ship sailed across the Atlantic, so they thought they'd get a better reception surrendering in Liverpool than if they surrendered here in the USA. I don't know, but definitely Liverpool. The reason that happened at all was because of the cotton connection. Liverpool continued to support the Confederacy during the American Civil War. well, I say Liverpool did, probably not everybody there did, but lots of the people with money tended to support the Confederate side because they were very keen to keep the cotton trade going, and it was perceived to be an issue over the cotton trade. And we'll come on to a little bit of that in a moment. There are other connections too. The Beatles, for example, probably Liverpool's most famous export, probably the most famous cultural phenomenon of the 20th century for those of you too young to remember the Beatles. But famously, of course, they were very, very, very fundamentally influenced by American music, by the kind of music that is perpetuated that I've been hearing almost ad nauseum here in New Orleans since I got here a couple of days ago. And all the Beatles have said, you know, Liverpool was the first port of entry for all the new ideas that were coming out of the States in those days. This was in the 40s, 50s and 60s. And that included the music, it included the blues, included jazz and so on and so forth. So all the great American musicians influenced the Beatles. The Beatles have kind of given it back to the world in lots of different ways. And there's an irony there because, of course, Liverpool was the capital city of the transatlantic slave trade at one time. So let's hope I can... Oh, there's Liverpool. Okay. So it's a view of Liverpool. You'll see the similarity between Liverpool and New Orleans straight away with a big sheet of water in front. That's the River Mersey. This is the 300th anniversary of the foundation of New Orleans. Liverpool has been around a little bit longer than that. It was founded in 1207 by King John. But even then there are similarities because nothing happened between 1207 and 1715. Very, very little happened. And what happened in 1715 is that in Liverpool, because of this tidal range of water, which is 30 feet, I don't know how that translates into yards and so on. It's a lot anyway. The water goes up and down an awful lot depending on whether the tide's in. Because this meant that when ships were in Liverpool, in the original, the original muddy pool that means Liverpool, used to fall over when the tide went out. They'd go in when the river was in spate, and then they'd fall over, which of course was not great for trade. So the Liverpudlians, being the entrepreneurial people that they are, invented the world's first wet dock where the ship didn't fall over when the tide went out. The river went down, but the dock stayed okay, so you could still load and unload. 1715. So even then there are similarities between the two cities in that their origins, the origins of their respective greatness was round about the same time. But there was a problem in terms of Liverpool being a great city. Probably once upon a time the greatest port in the world. Certainly the greatest port in the British Empire. The British Empire at that time was the greatest empire the world had ever seen or is ever likely to see. Although fingers crossed, you can't be too sure about that. So lots of wealth flowed through Liverpool, but it was the thriving city largely in the 18th century because of its reliance on the slave trade and so on and so forth. There were other reasons for Liverpool's prosperity, so please don't misunderstand me. Nonetheless, without the slave trade, it wouldn't have been the prosperous place it was. I'm a little embarrassed at this map, but as you can see, it's moving. I didn't even know that. Compared with Priscilla's brilliant map of the slave trade, look at this thing. But mine moves. So you can see the essence of the triangular trade. What used to happen is that manufactured goods would go from UK, made in places like Birmingham and Manchester. Everything was exported through Liverpool, inevitably. Liverpool people all had a share in the slaving ships. So what would happen is that the slaving ships would go from the UK to Africa, exchange the finished goods for enslaved Africans, and then take them across the Atlantic in the so-called Middle Passage. Now, I have to point out at this stage that most of the enslaved Africans were taken to the Caribbean, to the British colonies in the Caribbean, rather than to what we now know as the USA. It's a very common misconception that Liverpool ships were full of people that eventually ended up in the USA. It's simply not true. I think the Portuguese were probably responsible for most slaving over the period of enslavement, which was 16th, maybe 15th century, all the way through to the late 19th century. So it's a very long period of time. The Portuguese were involved in the trade very early on, as were the Spanish, The French were obviously very heavily involved, particularly in bringing enslaved Africans to New Orleans. The British tended to take them to the Caribbean, which in the 18th century was the big deal in empire terms. It wasn't actually the USA. And although I kind of would say this, wouldn't I? The loss of the 13 colonies was not as a bigger blow to the empire as it clearly, we look back and we think now, well, my God, imagine the empire losing the USA at that time. At that time, the USA was a tiny little trading peanut compared with the Caribbean. I'm always reminded when I look at this of it was Colin Powell, who I think was Chief of Staff in the USA a while ago. And I think he said, I paraphrase along the lines of that his parents, I think he was born in the Caribbean, and then his parents moved to the USA. And he said, I was lucky because if my parents had moved to Britain, I would have been driving a bus. And they came to the USA, and I'm now Chief of Staff. And that's really how the trade worked. So finished goods going from the UK to Africa, enslaved Africans being loaded up, taken across to this side of the pond, and going back, cotton, particularly cotton, but other forms of goods as well, finished goods, sugar. By this time, by the late 18th century, Europe was obsessed with sugar, and we're all wearing cotton now. I mean, cotton has been around for a long time, and it'll probably never go away. Liverpool remains, by the way, the capital of the cotton trade in the whole world. It was then, it still is. It's one of the few things that have lasted from that period, other than the horrible legacies of the transatlantic slave trade itself. Okay. So this is how the trade worked. The ships tended to be fitted out in Liverpool. We still have the dry docks where the slave ships were fitted out and kitted out and loaded up and so on and so forth. But it's important to remember that there were very, very few enslaved Africans ever put in an appearance in Liverpool. That wasn't the way that the trade worked. The trade worked by finished goods going onto the ships taking the finished goods to Africa, exchanged there for human beings, taken across to this side of the Atlantic with finished goods going back again. These are the kind of goods that were being traded. Britain at the time in the 18th century was developing itself into the world's first industrial nation. So it was making lots and lots and lots of different things, all of which were seen as valuable by some Africans. That's what a typical slave ship captain looked like. Getting on the ships, life on board, which was obviously horrendous in all its respects, and a list of slaves. Liverpool was probably responsible for about 1.5 million slaves being brought across to this side of the Atlantic. So numerically, nobody knows, of course, nobody does know how many people were enslaved during this period. Estimates range between, I think, about 6.5 million to 15 million or more. Whatever, it was an awful lot of people, a lot of bodies, and at different times, different places were responsible for most of the trade. During the industrialised period of the transatlantic slave trade, Liverpool was the undoubted capital. It financed more ships, it was bringing more people across. Okay. Arriving in the Americas. We like to call them the Americas, we Europeans. It fits all different types of... And then abolition. In the slave trade was abolished in the British Empire in 1807, which is a key date because the bicentenary of 1807, 2007, was not that long ago, which is the year that we created this place, the International Slavery Museum. This is the modern day response. It's one of the legacies, really, of the transatlantic slave trade, finally recognising this great hidden part of British history. I was brought up in a number of British schools, and I never learnt a thing about the transatlantic slave trade. As far as I was concerned, as far as most British school kids are concerned, it's something that never happened. The empire was a great thing. It was the British going out there and bringing lots of good things, including God and so on and so forth, to lots of other countries around the world, and railways and the civil service and so on. But we tend not to be taught about the more negative aspects of empire. And believe me, I've now learnt that there are very, very many, not least the transatlantic slave trade. So a number of us felt that it was time Liverpool said more than it was saying about this part of its history. There are voices that say, this isn't great for tourism. I'm sure you've heard this kind of thing here in New Orleans. We don't want to talk about that dark, dangerous stuff. You know, can't we just talk about the great successes, the fact that, you know, we invented the sewerage and fresh water and so on in Liverpool. That'll bring lots of tourists. Yes, well, of course that will. For those people who are obsessed with tourists bringing money and jobs and so on, it's an important deal. So although I sound a bit sneery about it, nonetheless, I do understand what they're talking about. But hey, great museums are great museums. One of the things I should have said earlier on is that my museum service, National Museums Liverpool, we run 8 museums in Liverpool. We attract about 3 million visitors a year, which is about 5 times what it was a few years ago. So we're doing something right. And our argument is that if you do great museums really well, it kind of doesn't matter what your topic is, as long as this is what people want to see. And the Slavery Museum is something that we're particularly pleased with. This is the building that houses the Slavery Museum. We're setting the truth free. It's a very activist, very angry place. I don't think you can be anything other than angry about the transatlantic slave trade, and we don't shy away from that. We don't pretend to be neutral about racism and the enslavement of Africans by wealthy Europeans. Sorry, I keep doing that. And that actually says, although I doubt whether you can read it, but we've had some criticism from people that say this is all about the USA. Lots of your quotes are from the USA. Well, yes, they are, because the USA is one of the places where the fight for civil rights led to lots of commentary about the iniquities of the slave trade. And to be fair, not many British people over the past 200 or 300 years have been particularly vocal. I think it's changing now, and it's interesting that one of the preoccupations in all European nations is with modern slavery nowadays. And because there's a preoccupation with modern slavery that can be a combination of, you know, sex trafficking, the conveyancing around the place, mostly of white people unwillingly, it's suddenly become a big burning issue for everybody. So although we created the International Slavery Museum out of the fact that it was black people that were being trafficked by white people, nonetheless, it's 10 years later, British government and others now appear to be becoming much more interested in the legacies of the enslavement of people for different reasons from us. The Slavery Museum itself, sorry, I promise I won't do that again. The Slavery Museum itself, it does begin with life in West Africa. There was a lot of life going on, as we've heard from, not least from Jessica's talk, a lot of very vibrant cultures in Africa when the Europeans put in an appearance and decided to start enslaving people as a form of cheap labour. There's an awful lot going on there. Great creativity, great strong cultures, many of which, of course, were accompanied people that were enslaved and taken across to this side of the Atlantic, as we've seen. So there was a great deal of cultural life going on. These are just pictures from the International Slavery Museum. What's important, though, is that it's not just about black people as victims of white people. That would be a stupid way of approaching any history. And we do try our best to show also the achievement of black people. It's not just about looking at everybody through a slave-tinted spectacles. The sun never sets on the children of Africa. We're very in people's face in terms of visitors about making sure that they are aware that African influence is global, and it's not just about Africans, as I say, as being enslaved. It's very hard-hitting. So this particular Ku Klux Klan outfit came from upstate New York. Apparently it was found by a family, and they were mortified to find this among their belongings and hid it away. And eventually it got hidden away and it got sent across to the UK, where they were mortified to find it among their belongings, and they hid it away again. And eventually one of them rang us up and said, "We've got this Ku Klux Klan uniform. It's a bit embarrassing, really. Would you like it at the Slavery Museum?" So we said, "Well, that'd be fantastic, thank you very much." So that's why this KKK outfit from New York State has ended up on display in the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. It's a very emotional place. I think it's very important that we don't try to anaesthetise the subject matter. It's powerful, it's hard-hitting. We don't avoid the fact that it was horrible. It was horrible. There are horrible consequences that we live with today, not least racism. For example, we have the occasional death threat to staff. We have swastikas and so on painted on the museum. It's not, I wouldn't want to exaggerate that too much. I think that most of the reaction is of bitter regret and indeed astonishment, particularly from British visitors, that this is how the world used to operate. And the message, I guess, of the Slavery Museum, and this is something which I guess would be valid throughout the world, is that we mustn't, it's not just a matter of not forgetting what did happen, but of looking and understanding the consequences that are still with us to this very day. We do various things to recognise. See, I managed to move my papers then without bashing the microphone. I am improving. I'm like Bart Simpson. Eventually, if I get something wrong often enough, I'll stop doing it. But only eventually, you know. It takes some time. So Slavery Remembrance Day. I don't know whether this happens in the States, but 23rd of August was the anniversary of the uprising in Haiti. The Haitian Uprising. Therefore, in different places around the world, this is celebrated in different ways. In Liverpool, we've been consistent for about a generation now, that every 23rd of August, and it's a blooming inconvenient time of year because it's in a very British way, lots of people are away on holiday. Sometimes we wish that the Haitians had rebelled on a different day. More convenient, but hey, you know, that's life, as it were. So every year we organise something where we try to get the whole subject thought about by modern British people and the many visitors that increasingly go to Liverpool. The Anthony Walker Education Centre is part of the Slavery Museum. Anthony Walker was a young black lad, came from Liverpool, had a white girlfriend, was minding his own business one day, and he was murdered by somebody that decided that he didn't like the look of a young black guy and a young black girl walking along the street together. So it was a very big deal in Britain. It's one of these horrendous racially motivated attacks. We immediately contacted the family and said, would you mind if we commemorate Anthony in the Slavery Museum? It's just a few years ago, and they were happy with what we were up to. They trusted us by this time. They didn't think we were going to be abusive or inappropriate. And the fact that it is the education centre, I think, is particularly important. School Takeover Day and the legacies of the Transatlantic slavery. You notice that there's a couple of American athletes here with a picture of the white guy, who I think was an Australian, the one whose idea it was to wear the gloves. And although he didn't, you know, end up with his fist in the air for the Black Power salute, he was wearing appropriate stuff, and he was clearly part of the gang. And it's often neglected, the fact that this white guy, I don't think he ever represented Australia again, because the sporting authorities in Australia really didn't like this kind of subversive behaviour. So is it Smith and Carlos? Okay, and the guy whose name nobody can ever remember, but we do, and it's very important to us that that legacies and the whole civil rights movement is something that we think arose very much out of the transatlantic slave trade. And there are many great acts of bravery. Now, the Slavery Museum ranges across a whole range of issues. It's primarily concerned with legacies of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's primarily concerned with issues of racism arising out of black and white stuff. Nonetheless, we do deal with other subjects. Home Alone, for example, is about domestic servitude. White Gold is all about the cost of cotton, which continues to be an industry that has a lot of explaining to do in terms of how it operates. There's a lot of child labour involved in the cotton industry, for example. 42, that's the life expectancy of people born in Sierra Leone. 42, can you imagine? It's half what it is in the Western nations. I once saw something that said it's the unluckiest place in the world for a child to be born, Sierra Leone. And that's because of the legacies that have flowed from the fact that the transatlantic slavers were very busy in Sierra Leone. Brutal exposure is about the Belgians. No European nation can hold up its hands and say, well, you know, we weren't involved. Every European nation had an involvement. And the Belgians behaved abominably, as did the British, as did the French, as did the Spanish and Portuguese, and the Danes and the Germans and the Swedes and everybody else. Broken Lives is about the caste system in India. So you'll see that already we're shifting away from purely looking at black and white racism arising out of the transatlantic slave trade. Not black and white racism, you know, black and white racism. And we look at other forms of racism and inequality and disadvantage too. And the Art of Solidarity is posters about Cuba, a place that has supported lots of subversive movements throughout the world, particularly in Africa, again arising out of the slave trade. Ink and Blood, Stories of Abolition, that's still showing at the moment until the 8th of April. Interesting that we've had to borrow stuff from France in order to beef up what we've got on show there. But this is very much a live subject. We've very recently acquired this painting, Am I Not a Man and a Brother? A very famous image, probably the first use of the corporate logo, at least in history, in that this particular imagery was used by the abolitionists. It appeared in Wedgwood pottery, it appeared in a number of different ways, and we're very pleased to have been able to acquire the original circa 1800 picture. Contemporary slavery, we continue to collect. Slavery has not gone away. In fact, it's probably worse now than it's ever been in terms of numbers. You'll see the very nice looking bracelet down at the left-hand corner there. That's actually a slave bangle worn around the ankle in the country of Niger, or Niger, as I'm a bit uncertain of my pronunciations now, but Niger, the country that's north of Benin. And it was used as a mark of the fact that the wearer is owned by the owner of the bangle. We continue to collect on prostitution, I see is featured there. I think that partnerships and initiatives are particularly important in this issue. We've got to kind of stick together. You know, there's a lot of people out there that don't like this kind of stuff. They find it threatening, they find it subversive, they find it inappropriate. They like to think it's something that's finished and done with. Can we just move on now? You know, can we talk about nice things? And in any event, whoever it was, they're better. I mean, and I've seen all this. People are better off now because their forebears were enslaved than they would have been had they stayed in Africa. You get all sorts of bizarre arguments. So it's very important that we keep up the good fight, I think, but we can only do that in concert with other people. And these are just some of the examples. Stop the Traffic, Liverpool against trafficking, and so on and so forth. There is the Federation of International Human Rights Museums, which we lead from Liverpool. Everybody that's remotely interested in this kind of issue should be a member of FIRM if you have any connections with museums, and that goes for all the academics, and I know there are many certainly speaking at this symposium. And I think at that point I will stop. We've still got a short while for questions, if there are any. But thank you.